Live, a Merrill Moss media production. It's National Library Week, and we wanted to chat with best-selling author Katherine Neville about all the wonderful work that she's doing with libraries, particularly the Smithsonian libraries in Washington, D.C. Katherine was the first author ever invited onto the board of the Smithsonian, and she's been working on a passion of hers, which is dreaming up new and exciting library awards for 6 years. Catherine is the #1 internationally best-selling author of A Calculated Risk, The Magic Circle, The Eight, and The Fire, which is the sequel to The Eight. Thank you so much for joining us today, Catherine. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Amanda.
And so we're going to dive right in and talk all about libraries. So I just want to hear a little bit about how you first became involved with the Smithsonian.
Well, I was, as you said, the first author ever invited onto the board of the Smithsonian, and the reason that they invited me onto the board, Nancy Gwynn, who's the director of the libraries, revealed in one of my meetings, in one of my interview meetings to be on the board, that she really wasn't interested in Katherine Neville for her skills. She was interested in her for her Rolodex. Because all the authors in Washington, D.C., and I got very tired. I came from the Western half. I started as a writer in the Western half. I was in San Francisco. And when I moved to Washington, D.C., we discovered that we were all kept apart. We were herded into separate pens, the journalists, the historians, the literary writers, the best-selling popular writers. And so we decided that we were going to have a party on our own. And so everybody gave their email addresses, and we threw a huge party. This is about 10 or 12 years ago, in the middle of a conference called Malice Domestic. Every year, all the authors go to the Edgar Allan Poe Awards in New York, and then they all take the train down and go to the Agatha Christie Awards in Washington, D.C. So we knew they were coming, so we threw a big party, and everybody had such a great time. We had 87 authors there.
Wow.
And in my apartment, and we said, well, we could do this to raise money for not just to have fun, but to raise money for all our pet projects. So we did things for Penn Faulkner. We had, one of my great things is I love libraries. And I love to find ways to get people to know how to use libraries and how to discover libraries. So Nancy Gwynn, the director of the Smithsonian Institution Libraries, of which, by the way, we have 21 libraries. There's a library in every museum and research center of the Smithsonian, from the Cooper Hewitt in New York all the way down to the Tropical Research Center in the Panama Canal.
Wow.
So a lot of libraries and millions of books, millions of rare books. It's the largest museum library collection really in the world, I believe, and certainly the most prestigious. We also are the spearhead people for the Biodiversity Heritage Library. So anyway, Nancy kept getting invited to these parties because she was part of the author sort of focus group. And her husband, John Cole, who's director of the Center for the Book at the Library of Congress and another librarian, said, well, why don't you invite Neville to get on the board? She seems to have a really great Rolodex. And so we did. And we've raised money for the libraries. We've raised, visibility is more important even than money, because a lot of Americans don't know that we have all these books and they belong to us, the American people. And so we had one at the Natural History Museum. We had one at the Hirshhorn. We had one in my apartment in D.C. And we would have a list of prestigious authors be the hosts. And so I said to all the female authors, well, we can't just put a bunch of women authors on the list. We have to have some guys, too, so that everybody will show up. And they won't think it's just a salon, a literary salon. So we did, and we've been doing this for about 6 years now. A couple of times a year, we have some fabulous event for one of the libraries, and we've had one event where we had all these amazing authors show up. Christopher Paolini, who writes all the Aragon books,
Mhm.
and R.L. Stein, and
Right.
Lisa Scottolini. We're all our
Yeah.
co-hosts. We
All
have a
the
really great time.
yeah.
One of the three of the people who help put the parties together are my fellow authors here in DC, Daniel Stashauer, Marcia Talley,
Mhm.
and Louis Bayard. And we periodically have a lunch and sit down and eat a lot of great food and plan what the next library event will be. So that's one of the things we do. I want to talk about some of the other stuff. But I was asked by one of the sisters in crime,
Mhm.
GM Malliot. A lot of people will have read her books. She sent me a note when she knew I was going to do the live chat today.
Mhm.
And she said, you know, Sisters in Crime, which is the group that sponsors the Agatha Christie
Right.
Awards every year, they have a special, and I have to read this because I didn't know about it myself. Um, Sisters in Crime has a program that awards money to libraries who enter a monthly drawing. And she said details on the Sisters in Crime national website are will tell librarians and libraries how to do it, which is a great thing because people don't realize how much authors support the whole concept of libraries.
Yeah.
It's not enough just to digitalize so that we can have the books available. If you could see behind me, I have some. I just moved from my old house to the place that was my office, the Japanese
Mhm.
house, and I had to move 12,000 books.
Wow. That's no small feat.
Yeah, I know. I moved some of them. I moved some of them to my office, to the Japanese house. A lot of them, the ones I'm working with, but the others you have to find places for. And I cannot, as Thomas Jefferson said, I cannot live without books, but I cannot live without books right in my immediate proximity.
Bless you. Yeah.
So you know, libraries are really, really important to me.
Right. And you talked about some of the authors that have been, fellow authors involved in the libraries. Um, what kind of outreach have you done this year? Kind of, do you get new people on board every year, new writers? Like what do you do
Uh,
to spread the word?
for, you mean for the parties or for the? Well, I brought actually on the board of the Smithsonian. I said I was the first author on the board. But I thought maybe after my first year or so, they might never have another author on again because I'm so gangbusters gung ho. But actually, I brought on to the board Steve Berry, whom
Mhm.
everyone will know,
Yeah,
fabulous thriller writer.
absolutely.
And Steve, in the year that he came onto the Smithsonian Library's board with me, was the year that he was appointed the first ever in
Mhm.
history. Um, spokesperson for the American Library Association for National Historic Preservation of Books. I forget how they put it exactly, but they have a week
Mhm.
every year, the ALA, where
Right.
they focus on preserving and restoring books. And we, Smithsonian Libraries, of course, also has an adopt a book program for our
Yeah.
rare books, which is great. You can go out to our website and see because we have libraries at the National Air and Space Museum on the history
Mhm.
of flight, we have libraries at Natural History that have, I think we've got uh, I uh, Dr. Livingston's rifle, I believe.
Oh wow.
I think we have in one of our libraries we have artifacts. I think we have a handkerchief of Elvis Presley or something.
Oh, that's
They
cool.
do really interesting things, yeah, and things that connect with the culture of of America, the entire culture of America.
Mhm.
So it's a great archive. I wanted to talk a little bit about a grant that I created
Yes.
with my late spouse, Dr. Carl Pribram. He was a big educator, brain scientist,
Mhm.
and he wanted to do a grant. We discovered that there was no grant available for mid-career educators in America. No grant. It was all for doctoral students or postdocs.
Yeah.
And so he wanted to create a grant so that people could come and use the Smithsonian libraries.
Mhm.
Every year they give a grant, a different museum library um, opts to do the grant. This year it's going to be for, I don't know who the recipient is yet, but it's going to be at the National Museum of the American Indian to do research in their archives, which are fantastic.
One of my favorites.
Last year it was for the African Art Museum, the National Museum of African Art. And it's wonderful because we did it so that you could do it in the middle of the summer because it's for middle school, high school, and college teachers who want to further their career and pursue their studies, but they don't necessarily get sabbaticals. High school and middle school teachers don't get sabbaticals, so they can't take off the whole year. And they have to be in residence for all the grants at the Smithsonian Library of where their grant is located. So we did it so they could do it just in the summer. And they could still get the same amount of money as other grant recipients. So that's called the Neville Prebram Mid-Career Award.
Right.
And that's really interesting. And I encourage people to apply for it because each year it will be in a different museum library.
That's fantastic. And there's also the Art and Lit Award. Can you tell us more about that?
That was the most fun. Excuse me. I've just gotten over a cold, so the Art and Lit Award. I'm doing research on right now on a book that I've been working on for years about artists in the 1600s.
Right.
I found that most of the available material was incredibly boring, dry, full of jargon. I went to the streets of Rome and pounded the streets to do my own research. And somewhere along the way, I got the idea that there should be an award for writing anything about art.
Yeah.
Poetry, fiction, history, biography. So I created an award with the Library of Virginia and the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts both in Richmond. And they're both in the top 10 institutions of their kind in America. They were game. They took a gamble and let me go put this award together. I had a bunch of really wonderful people helping out with the committee to raise money and visibility. And the award is given each year in October for a book published in the previous year. The first award 3 years ago was given to Orhan Pamuk, who's a Nobel laureate in fiction, for a nonfiction book he wrote, The Innocence of Objects, which is about a museum he created in Istanbul, a fabulous book. So he flew in from Turkey, accepted the award, and the award recipient speaks at the museum on Friday night and then receives the award on Saturday at the fabulous awards banquet. It's like Hollywood, you know, all the top authors, and most of the awards are for Virginia writers, but the People's Choice Award is for a writer anywhere in America. And this award is international, the Art and Literature Award. And so it can be an author from any country, but it has to be a book published in America. In English. And so the judges can read it. The second year, Carolyn Kreider Ferranda, who's a poet, won it for a book-length work of poetry. She was a poet laureate of Virginia years ago, and it was a book about the relationship between Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. And then the third year, the award was for a work of fiction. So it's really been, and I've got information about these on my website, but basically my feeling is in order to support libraries, you have to be incredibly creative, even more creative than you have to be to support bookstores. So I'm out there in the street. And we named this award, I might add, after my very dear friend, all of our very dear friend, Mary Lynn Kotz, who's a journalist, a New York Times bestselling, as I am, a New York Times bestselling journalist. And Uh, and she is the person who wrote, everyone will know, the award-winning book about Robert Rauschenberg, the sort of definitive giant coffee table size biography of
Right.
Robert Rauschenberg.
Mm-hmm.
But she also, many people do not know, was the last journalist to interview Georgia O'Keeffe in Abiquiu, New Mexico.
Yeah.
So she's had a very colorful career. And she's gone down to Richmond each year and presented the award herself.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really fun.
Yeah. And so you've traveled to so many places. So what libraries top your must-see list, if you could give us a couple that are just your absolute favorite?
Well, I've just come back from a couple, but I got in very surreptitiously at the last moment. I went on a trip to Europe, and I went to, first of all, I can mention that I went to visit Franco Maria Ricci.
Mm-hmm.
Many people don't remember him anymore because his magazine has not been out for quite a long time, but it was the top art magazine in the history of the world. It was, FMR magazine was gorgeous. You can look online and see book signings of his back in the 60s,
Right.
and beside him at his book signing is standing Jackie Kennedy and the Pope. So everyone knew him,
Love it.
and he's still there, and he's just about to launch his magazine again. He got back all the rights to it. It had been sold to someone else, and it went defunct, and he got back the rights. It's absolutely gorgeous. He's also a publisher of fabulous books. I got as many as I could possibly carry home.
Mm-hmm.
And I really feel that his existence is almost like a library. He has a museum at his place in Parma, outside of Parma.
Mm-hmm.
He has a pyramid that I'm going to write some things about on my website.
Yep.
But it's a Masonic fabulous pyramid from the 1800s, designed as if it were from the 1800s. Anyway, that was one place. And then I also went to an archive and library in a private residence on an island in a lake and studied some of their papers. And it made me feel so wonderful to see these papers because in the Smithsonian libraries, we have one library called the Dibner Library of Science and Technology.
Mm-hmm.
One day I went in there, and sometimes they'll pull out books for people to look at, other board members or whoever happens to be visiting. And from across the room, I saw a letter lying on the table with a signature that everyone would recognize.
Mm-hmm.
And anyone would recognize the signature. Can you guess whose signature it was? I mean, even if you're not an American, you would recognize the signature. Okay, I'm revealing the signature.
Okay.
Galileo.
Oh my God.
Everyone recognizes Galileo's signature, even if you don't know who John Hancock was.
Right.
So I walked over and I looked at the letter and I said, what letter? How did we get this? Because we have, Baron Dibner was an inventor, and he endowed the Smithsonian and gave them a huge percent of his rare books library. He had collected rare books on science and technology from very early time, and we have those books there. So it was a thank you note to someone for getting him out of jail. And on the back, he had a little sketch of a water clock, and it was just wonderful. That's the kind of thing you only see if you set foot in a library.
Yeah.
So I went to this archive, and I was the last person to get in, basically, to see some of the documents because it's now being closed for inventories and all kinds of restoration. But it was wonderful to see letters that were written 400 years ago, 500 years ago.
Incredible.
It makes them real people.
Yeah.
It makes them real people. And there's something that you can't feel it until you can touch it. It's not real until you can touch it.
Wow.
So that's my library saga. I'm about to leave in a month from now for England and possibly Belgium to go and look at some other fascinating libraries where I've done most of my research remotely in these libraries by other scholars who've actually visited the libraries it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Right. And so the libraries in England, I'm sure, have lots of rarities. Is there anything you're looking to see, or are you just kind of going in?
Well, the book I'm writing is set in 1600,
Hmm.
and because it's set in 1600, that means there are a lot of 400 anniversaries coming up right now. It
Hmm.
starts in 1600 and goes on. And this year, one of those 400th anniversaries, I think, is the death of Shakespeare and the death of Cervantes.
Yeah, the big
So I'm
one.
thinking that there will be a lot of festivities in the streets going on
Yeah.
about that. I might have to go to Madrid too. Huh?
Hey, why not? Just a little library tour.
Well,
Sounds amazing.
I've always felt a connection with Cervantes anyway,
Hmm.
because he was in prison in the same town where I used to live.
That's amazing. Now, these days it's like the advent of ebooks, like it's just so much going on with that, and you can download apps and put them on your phone, and you can check out books on, your iPhones or what have you. What do you think is the future of libraries 20 years from now? Do you see something really amazing? It's kind of the same. Do you think there's going to
Oh
be a lot of
yeah,
changes?
oh absolutely. Well, as you know, my books have just gone into ebooks last year,
Exactly.
last July.
Hmm.
So that was my first exposure to the whole internet thing,
Right.
and I find it fascinating. But I think, people used to say when talkies came in the movies, it was the end of whatever, and when movies came in, it was the end of theater, and each thing that comes in is supposedly the death knell for the whatever the
Yeah,
medium was before it.
exactly.
But I see libraries as being uh, not just, as I said, one of our big projects at Smithsonian is the Biodiversity Heritage Library. That's all online.
Hmm.
People can share all their content from all over the world. It's really great. So I see it as being a cross-pollination more than anything. And as everybody knows who's read my books are written in a very matrixized form. They're not linear, they're
Hmm.
not horizontal. They're
Right.
sort of interwoven like a
Hmm.
tapestry. So the historic part and the modern part are connected. There are tales within a tale that go back in time. There are tales that project you forward in time
Right.
when we the reader know something's going to happen. And I think that's the same thing that's going to happen with the internet. And I love it that people are able to just pull up an app and get whatever kind of information. I think information should be driven by the user, by the person who wants to get the
Exactly.
information.
Hmm.
And the internet lets us do that more freely. As I said, I spent maybe 30 years trying to get into the archive that I just visited,
Wow.
and they only let a few people per year go in there
Yeah.
because it's rare.
Yeah.
And so I think that's something that was very fulfilling for me. But meanwhile, people can't get at that content and that information, and that's part of our history, a very valuable part of our history
Hmm.
that might not be available, otherwise available.
Hmm. Absolutely. Now, what other programs or news do you have, coming down the pipeline for libraries? Anything else you'd like to
Oh my gosh.
add? Do you
Well,
have reality?
uh, as as I said, I'm going to England, and I'm pulling strings right now. I had to do this. I hate to, I really could not get into a lot of the places I wanted to get into because I'm just a novelist. So uh, what I did was I telephoned my literary agent in Europe,
Mhm.
and because they handle all the sales for the Orient and for the Eastern Bloc and
Yeah.
all over Europe and
Hmm.
Scandinavia and so forth. And I said, okay, well, I just read a book by a famous author on the New York Times list, and he who will remain unnamed. And at the end of the book, I read the acknowledgments. At the end of the book, he said, I would like to thank my literary agents and my publisher for getting me into all these
Wow.
archives and secret places where I could do all this research. So I said, well, I'm just as important as he is. And I'm translated into more languages.
Yes.
So I want to play the famous author card. I always say famous author wants to come and do research in your archives or your library or something. And it actually did work. People were really happy to have someone interested in what they're doing. That's the
Yeah.
great thing about libraries and archives. They want people to know. And fiction has a little bit of more of a trump card, I would say, than nonfiction, because in nonfiction you have to be a scholar, have to get all your facts correct. But when you write fiction about an historic period, the thing people most often say to me when they interview me is, when I read your book, I felt like I was walking around inside the book with the other characters. That is the power of fiction. Fiction can bring alive not just history, but science, art. And so that's the reason I spend so much time, not just in libraries, but so much time on the street doing research, because you really want that feeling that you're inside a book.
Yes, absolutely. And I'm glad they understand how much research goes into your books, because it is necessary to go to these places and see all these wonderful things.
But you don't want it to be your researchers showing.
Exactly. Yeah. We have a couple viewer questions that came through that are
Right?
wonderful. Callie wants to know, what's the biggest misconception that you think, is tacked on to libraries and librarians?
Oh, well, when I first went onto the board of the Smithsonian Libraries, everybody said, "Oh, well, librarians are stuffy, and no one's interested in these musty archives and all this kind of thing." And I think that there is an image of librarians as speaking, because there is a certain jargon. There is a certain jargon for everything. As I said when we started out, art historians have a jargon, and the jargon can affect people in the wrong way, where they feel, these people are so far above me, I just can't understand what they're talking about. And that's the reason I love the fact that libraries like the Library of Virginia and the Smithsonian libraries are available to the public. I mean, they belong to the public. The books belong to us, the American people,
Right.
or the people of Virginia. So that part, I think, is fabulous. But I think that there has been a certain misconception that that's what librarians are like, and librarians are. I did an interview. We wanted to do a branding project for the Smithsonian Libraries, and to sort of get the image out there of what we're really all about, because there's so many books and so many topics.
Right.
And the most frequent reply I got when I asked the question, "What is the most valuable, uh, you know, benefit or device or thing about the libraries that you've been doing research in? What's the most valuable thing to you?" And they would say the librarian.
Yeah.
Because the librarian, one gentleman researcher said to me, he was incredible. He said, "I came there, I knew exactly what I was going to study. I knew exactly what I was interested in and what I was going to write my paper on. And after a week, the librarian had opened some drawers and shown me some papers and shown me this and that. And pretty soon, I expanded the scope of what I was going to do, and changed it drastically, because the librarian knew how to take me through the labyrinth of the information. So without the librarians, we don't have, we don't really have the kind of access that we need. Even you can look at 10,000 books, but you don't know what's in them. You don't know it's daunting without them.
They're good at what they do, and everything out there on social media right now is really showing they're adapting to, changes in technology. The trending hashtag for National Library Week is Libraries Transform, which I love, because it really is.
Yeah.
They're
And
so
that's
innovative.
it. That's it.
Absolutely.
It's so many authors. Some people don't realize so many fiction writers never would have been able to write the books they wrote if it weren't for libraries, because a lot of them weren't even able to travel a couple of hundred years ago or leave their town.
Yeah.
And there was another question.
Yeah, there is. There's actually a great one. Jocelyn wants to know, what's your fondest memory of visiting a library? And I'm thinking she wants to know something from childhood, perhaps. Maybe a
Oh,
first
my
fondest
fondest
memory.
memory of visiting a library?
Mhm.
Oh, Jocelyn, that's really hard because I've been in so many libraries. I think that I started to think of libraries in a different way when I started to read Borges, the poetry and the prose of Borges,
Right.
because he wrote so much about libraries and libraries being like a labyrinth and libraries being a mystical, magical place.
Hmm.
Um, but I do remember going into a library. It was my library in San Francisco, and it was a private library, the Mechanics Institute Library. And I was writing The Eight, my first book that got published, and I could not find out anything about Talleyrand
Hmm.
that matched. You know, I didn't care Encyclopedia Britannica, Will and Ariel Durant, whatever it was. They couldn't get the dates to match of when did Talleyrand go to Vermont to sell real estate? When did he get thrown out of England and have to go to Vermont to sell real estate? And so, um, can you see me, by the way?
Yeah, there's a
There
little
we
bit of
go.
light coming through, but now I see it better. Yeah.
Yeah, I have so much light behind me. So I said, well, what, how can I find out the truth about this? And they said, well, you can go. We have all of Talleyrand's autobiography and his private journals here in the library. So I said, oh, you do? Well, so I started reading them, and lo and behold, Talleyrand knew exactly when he went to America to sell
Yeah.
real estate. And he also knew that his ship almost crashed on the way out of the channel, and he landed on the Isle of Jersey, and there he met Benedict Arnold, who was another great trader who'd been thrown out of his country or escaped from his country. So I put that into the book, and right beside that section of this little tiny library in San Francisco was the complete 16-volume set of the translation by Sir Richard Francis Burton of The 1001 Nights.
Wow.
And I read that for a whole 5 years that I worked across the road from that library. And then I finally couldn't stand it anymore, so I bought the entire set myself.
That
So
means
I
it's a
have that
great
in my
one.
library.
I love
Yeah,
that.
next time we do a thing on libraries, I'll have to take my screen and show people some of my really
Great
fascinating books.
collection.
Thanks,
Well,
Jocelyn. Great question.
yeah, thank you so much, guys. So we've come to the end of the chat, but I just wanted to thank you again for coming on and talking about Library Week. It's been a pleasure, and thank you everyone for,
Thank you.
coming in and asking questions.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine.
Yeah.
Bye, Amanda.
Bye. Take care,
Bye.
Catherine. Bye.
Bye.